Hello and welcome to Behind the Scenes to the build AFK Gone Meta, which is a newer, more expensive version of our previous build AFK Gone Cheap. My name is Chrispied and I'm gonna take you through this series. Now you might wonder, why are we doing this series? Well, there are a couple of reasons. In the forums we get a lot of questions which covers the same topic, so I want to bring it up in this series to clear it up because it's easier to explain in a video format. Also, we just released the AFK Gone Meta montage video or build showcase, and we want to explain some of the mechanics behind the new concept, which is of course inspired by the build Stampede, which was Abberath's Hooves builds. So clearing speed and clearing setups, that's a very important topic, and we're gonna cover that first. We're first gonna talk about different clearing setups. We're gonna start with Abberath's Hooves, of course, which is the newest version. And we're gonna talk about a couple of other versions which are more cheap and better at other stuff. And also we're gonna check some clearing clips after that, and we're gonna compare them a bit. The order in which I'm gonna present those clips and the information about the clearing setups, it's the order that I prefer. So the setup I prefer the most, I'm gonna show to you first. And the setup I prefer the least is the one I'm gonna show you the last. So I'm gonna start with Abberath's Hooves and talking about it. It's a pair of boots which has a skill built into it, Abberath's Fury. And every time you take a step with those boots, you do an AoE damage. This damage will of course ignite enemies and it will trigger all the cast from damage taken setups and kill stuff. It's the clearing setup I prefer the most, and it has pretty decent single target damage, but not so great. After that I want to show you Incinerate. And Incinerate I think is very good at clearing, but it uses a lot of mana. The single target is okay, but not the greatest. Then after that I want to show you cast when channeling Scorching Ray. It's great at boss killing, it has nice single target, and it's good combined with the Taming. When clearing a map, to increase the clearing speed you can switch out Scorching Ray to Incinerate. This interacts very well with the Dying Sun Flask, which gives more projectiles. So it can have pretty good clear speed and the single target is great. Then after that I want to show you Spark. And Spark I don't like so much myself, but it's much like the Incinerate setup in terms of clearing, but it uses some less mana. And then lastly we have Blade Vortex, and why it's on the last place is because it's received a pretty bad nerf in the 2.6 patch. It's like this. You can only have one instance of Blade Vortex running, so if you have your level 19 Blade Vortex which you cast actively, you can't have a cast when damage taken set up with Blade Vortex, because it will overwrite it, making you do no damage. So I think we're gonna start talking about Abberath's Hooves, which is the highest focus of this clip. It is a very special pair of boots. It has the chance to ignite, which is very nice for our build. It has the increased fire damage per strength, which is also very useful for our builds. But what is the most important part of this boot is actually cast level 7 Abberath's Fury when equipped. This is the whole reason we take this pair of boots, because we lose a lot of life, a lot of resistance, and a lot of movement speed taking these. So it gotta be worth it, and I think it actually is worth it. This also costs about 2x in the temporary league, so it really has to be worth it. And I tried a lot of things. I watched the clip Stampede, which is an elementalist using these as a damage setup for clearing maps. And I tried to use the setup that person used, and that was added lightning damage, added cold damage, increased area of effect, and controlled destruction. This didn't work out too great. The damage wasn't that awesome of Abberath's Hooves. It was maybe doing a third of the damage of the fire burst, which is the main damage that our build makes. It comes from this skill. So I didn't like this setup. What is nice with Abberath's Hooves is that you don't use an active skill, so you can use up most of your mana. What is also interesting is that the skill Arctic Armor doesn't have really any good effect when you're walking around, because it only gives damage reductions when you're standing still. So I only used Anger as the aura with this one. Okay, with these, to make the damage very nice, I used a pair of Elemental Weakness gloves. And I also had dual curses from the tree, thanks to the node Whispers of Doom. And as a second curse, I used Blasphemy with Flammability. And this is to further increase the damage we make, because these curses double dip. They make our initial hit harder, and they make our secondary ignite harder. So it's very, very useful. When you walk, you will hit targets, which has a chance to activate your Fire Burst on hit, because you hit things. But it also has an ignite chance, so it has ignite to heal you and trigger all your cast from damage spells, thanks to Eye of Innocence. And all those other things do more damage than this setup. So I moved to the next setup, which I will call the Max Trigger setup. I thought I would utilize how much this trigger the other things to the maximum. So I put increased critical strikes in it to activate Elemental Overload, which we have in our tree, which makes us do 40% more elemental damage if we crit recently, or in the past 8 seconds. Then I used Increased Area of Effect to maximize the AoE. It's really necessary with Abberath Hooves. And then chance to ignite to trigger all the spells a lot, so they hit a lot, and we get more Fire Burst and more healing and more everything. Then as the last socket, because I didn't want to change the colors, was Blind or Cold Strike, or you can use Added Cold. It doesn't really matter. This setup was pretty nice, but it lagged a lot. And you use up a lot of essential sockets, which is very useful for your builds to harvest things. Also, these pair of gloves are pretty expensive, and it's hard to get good rolls on those. So I moved on, and I changed my setup a bit. I thought, why not get free Blasphemy by using a Curse on Hit? Because you could use Curse on Hit on Abberath Hooves, so every time you take a step and do damage with these boots, you will activate Curse on Hit, and you can link 2 curses to it, even 3 if you'd like to. I used this with Increased Area of Effect, so I rolled my Abberath Hooves with 4 blues. This is very expensive and not worth it. So how did this version clear? I didn't think it was too great, because the area was a bit small and wasn't really enough. So what did I do? I kept my blue sockets. I put in a Blasphemy, Elemental Weakness, and Flammability. The problem is that this reserves 70% of the mana, and your Anger reserves 50% of your mana. So we had to find a solution to that. And the solution was just crafting a fire damage mod on my scepter. So that's what we did. We got fire damage so that we can ignite. And because we want fire damage on all our spells. So this is very important. This cannot be skipped. And this setup was actually pretty great. You get a high level of curses. They are really high level. The Blasphemy increases their effect even further. So it's really a great setup. Now the increased AoE makes it reserve almost all your mana. And you don't want to have 4 blues on your Abberath Hooves. That's pretty expensive. So what you can do is you can put these 3 in any other gem item. You can put it in your, for example, your sword. And you can put your things from your sword in your gloves or your boots. I would probably prefer the boots because these are easy to socket. So I would put this Blasphemy setup in my sword. There's a Vorici way of making it 3 blue. Let's see, 3 blue for 120 chromes. Which isn't nothing compared to using 1,000 chromes or more, maybe 2,000 chromes on rolling 4 blue Abberath Hooves. Now, this setup was great. It is very fast clear speed, but the clear speed is dependent on other things, because you're just walking with these boots and you're not doing the damage with them. The damage comes from other things, you're just triggering the other things. What is very important is the faster you walk with Abberath's Hooves, the more hits you do per second. So with our Flask setup, we got a Quicksilver with movement speed, we got a Silver Flask which also gives movement speed, and we got of course bleeding immunity on it because it's a high risk of dying to that. Then we have a Dying Sun to increase the AoE. It is a very expensive flask which can be replaced with about any flask. Then we use Overflowing Chalice, which is to keep our flasks up at all times basically. Then we use Druid's Elixir, and this is a really phenomenal flask because first of all it will damage yourself when you press on it. Because I in my latest tree don't have any chaos resist, this will do 16% of our maximum life as damage. This means that it will trigger a savage hit. And a savage hit is a hit that removes more than 15% of our maximum life. This will make us leech 100% of our damage as life, so it's very safe. And it also makes us do more damage, also great. But that's not all, it will trigger all your cast when damage taking spells and hit everything around you and trigger your fire burst almost instantly on any pack. So it's phenomenal. You run into the pack, you press this flask and it's like boom. Also it gives you charges, it gives you power, frenzy, endurance charges, and I'll tell you why these are useful while going over my chest plate. So in my chest plate I'm having a cast when damage taking setup. Now I have an increased duration to increase the duration of the cast when damage taken setup. And this is very useful for all the socketed gems. I also have chance to ignite, as this is also very useful. Now what we socket in this is Firestorm. We have Blade Vortex, both have much use of increased duration support. This made it possible to drop the 3 nodes that gives increased duration from the tree and take life instead. Then we have the last thing, the Phase Run. And the Phase Run really utilizes the Druid's Elixir flask, because when you press this flask, it will do 2 things to Phase Run. It will supply it with a frenzy charge, and it will trigger the Phase Run. And you also have increased duration from here. So the frenzy charge gives it 100% increased skill duration. The increased duration gives a 74% increased skill duration. So you'll trigger a Phase Run that lasts for approximately, around 4 or 5 seconds. And this is great every time you press your Druid's Elixir. Of course it has a cooldown of 4 seconds. So and that's about how often you press it, because it's quite a distance between packs. Now you might wonder, does this skill deactivate when your cast when damage taken setups activate? And no, it does not. Because performing any skill replaces this buff with one that boosts melee damage. So you lose the movement speed and get melee damage when you use a skill. But you don't use any skill. They activate automatically. So you keep the buff from a Phase Run. We can show it right here actually. There you have your 5-second Phase Run. And you had all your cast when damage taken spells activate, and it will still be activated, so it's not affected. Yeah, if you have 3 frenzy charges you get that 9 seconds, so it's really great. This chest with the Abberath's Hooves and with your Flask setup has an insane clear speed, and the single target speed, the single target damage is pretty great as well, because you have a lot of double dipping, you have dual curses which reduces rare enemies resistances, so it's really great. On bosses you can just swap out your increased AoE for concentrated effect on a fire burst, and most of them, even up to tier 15, will burn down in a couple of seconds, usually less than 10 seconds. Now there are 2 more things I want to mention about Abberath's Hooves that I almost forgot to tell you guys. And is that when you don't have the Blasphemy setup in your Abberath's Hooves, you might wonder, what should I keep in my Abberath's Hooves? And you move but you keep the increased AoE in your Abberath's Hooves. You don't need to have it with your Blasphemy setups. And then you can put a cast when damage taken setup or whatever in those boots. Maybe you want to put your your Whirling Blade setups actually. That would be the best. It's really easy to put it in there because 2 greens are easy to roll. So what you could do is put your Blasphemy in your gloves or there, and then you move what you had in your Race of the Seventh Sun, that is the Whirling Blade setup, to the Abberath's Hooves, together with increased AoE to boost the skill Abberath's Fury. The second thing I want to mention is, of course, you are wondering, do I have to have Bell of the Beast? Do I have to have it 6-linked? No, you can use just a rare chest. It doesn't have to be 6-linked, it can be 5-linked. Under 5-link I think it's pretty bad. You can craft it with something called Essence of Hysteria. No, Essence of Greed, I'm sorry. It gives life, and the best version, the Deafening, gives like 125 to 130 or something, which gives you this beautiful chest. And you only lose about 200 life. In this case you lose only 150 life or 160 life. But when you have your ring and stuff with extra life, you only lose that. Now, what skill setup would I drop in the chest if I would only go 5-link? I would drop the Blade Vortex and put it in the helmet. It's not so important to have duration on it. There's also a version where you can run Val Haste in your chest plate, which you manually activate, but it isn't too great after the nerf on Val Haste, so you don't need to put it there, but you can have it instead of Blade Vortex like that as well, but it's not really recommended. Yeah, then I want to mention one last thing. We rely on getting one-shots with a scepter, and to be able to get one-shots we utilize the double dipping of Burn. Now, some of you maybe run Taming with this build, which are great. The Taming Emberwake setup is great for other versions of this build, but with Abberath's Hooves, it's not that great. Because what you do is you reduce your burn to 1/5 of his normal damage. You do 5 times less damage. What you instead want to use is Muku's Embrace, because it gives Ignite chance, fire damage, and it ignites yourself, which will make your Eye of Incense do more damage. And it will also activate your fire leech on it, which is very useful. So I would totally run Muku's Embrace, and as a second ring you can roll just a life ring, or in my case I rolled a opal ring. And you can roll fire damage on it by using a essence as well. This is essences are great for many things, and you use Essence of Anger. I think I use a Shrieking Essence of Anger on it, but you can also use a Deafening Essence of Anger. But they're more expensive, so I ran the 3 times more cheap Shrieking, so you can roll it more times to get the rolls you want. This is pretty much it for the Abberath's Fury and Abberath's Hooves. I mentioned you needed to compensate some resistance on the boosts, and you can do that partially by your gearing with a ring you rolled with a opal ring and stuff. There we have it, and the Mukus gives a lot of resistance. You can also compensate it by getting like jewels with all resistance. I didn't need too much of that. I solved it anyways, thanks to my gear, so I think I removed every jewel with resistance I had. Yeah, so that's how to compensate that. You can also roll something on your helmet if you have luck. I didn't need that, I just went for max life on my... Yeah, and that was it for Abberath's Hooves. Now the second setup I want to mention is the Incinerate setup. I think it's maybe the second fastest clearing after the Abberath's Hooves. The single target on this isn't great, but it's not terrible either. I think maybe it's better than Abberath's Hooves. But on Abberath's Hooves we also have a setup with Valve Righteous Fire, which I will cover in another clip. But yeah, so Incinerate is great. I use it with greater multiple projectiles and faster projectiles. These are a really good combo. I also have my Dying Sun, which is not a must by any means, but it also gives 2 more projectiles. It's really great. Then we have faster casting. It's very useful. Of course it's not a must. We only use the Incinerate to trigger a fire burst, just as we use Abberath's Hooves we don't really want to make any damage with it. The fourth, after the faster casting, I would use the chance to ignite, because we want to ignite as much as possible to trigger our cast when damage taken setups, basically. This is the basic setup. If you want to go 6 link, you can use control destruction, but as I mentioned, we don't want to do too much damage with the setup. It's just to trigger the other things. You can use also fire pan because it's easier maybe to get a red socket. So yeah, fire pan would be great. This setup is great to use with dual Mucus Embrace, because using Mucus Embrace makes you cast the Incinerate faster, and makes you Whirling Blade faster. And since you don't run with this version, you don't use Abberath Hooves, you just Whirling Blade around. These are very useful for the attack and cast speed. So yeah, I would really use these rings with it. Of course, the single target isn't great. The taming and stuff can be switched in when you come to bosses and things like that. But often your ignite from your fire burst is so powerful that you can just switch in a concentrated effect and it will be enough to maybe 2 or 3 shot the boss. You can use the dual cursing with this setup as well. It's really up to you. If you have this, you don't need anger, so it's really nice. Also with this setup you can use Arctic armor really, because you stand still all the time. You Whirling Blade, you incinerate, you Whirling Blade, incinerate. So it is very useful. Yeah, that's the Incinerate. Yeah, as for the third setup I want to cover, it's Scorching Ray with cast when channeling and Firestorm. Now, what is so great with this setup? It's very versatile. You can have a pretty great clear speed by just changing out Scorching Ray to Incinerate when you're clearing the map. And then on the bosses you can use Scorching Ray or Incinerate, because Scorching Ray reduces the resistance and uses less mana, but Incinerate will ignite more and trigger your spells more and heal yourself more. So you can go by anyone. I think Scorching Ray is the one I prefer on bosses. It also looks a bit cooler. Now, what you want to combine with these three, is a increased duration. So your firestorms will last longer. This also makes it possible for you to drop in duration nodes on a tree and get more life. Then we want to have chance to ignite to increase the damage. Then the last support we want to use is concentrated effect. Because what concentrated effect does is concentrating the firestorm. It will increase its ignites, but it will also make the area it hits a lot smaller. This is very useful on bosses because you want all your firestorms to hit the boss. Now if I would drop any of these to make a 5 link, I would drop the increased duration. Alright? And make with this 5 link. Now you might wonder, oh, 5 blue in a Bellow of a Beast, that's impossible. But you can actually, as I mentioned earlier, you can get a 5 linked ES chest or a hybrid chest, but ES chest preferred. And you can just roll an Essence of Greed and you will only lose like 200 life or something like that. Just don't have too much int requirement because our int isn't very high. Alright, this setup I like to use with the Taming and Emberwake. Maybe when clearing the map you can use dual Mucus Embrace, but really to get the insane single target damage you want the Taming and Emberwake. Because these firestorms will hit a lot of times. Every time they can ignite, okay, it makes 5 times less damage. But instead of just having 1 ignite, you can have up to 300 ignites. So for this setup it's really useful. And you stack up the damage really quickly, and with the Taming, if you have 300 ignites, that's a 3000% increased damage. That's 30 times more damage. Of course, that will not be the real world scenario. Maybe you have had a 5 damage multiple from the beginning, so you made 5 times your base damage. And with this you maybe reach 35, so that's only 7 times more damage. But 7 times more damage, that's insane. So with a cast when channeling setup, I would use Emberwake and the Taming. Absolutely. Alright, so now we've come to the maybe to the one of the two worst clearing setups. They are really slow in the clearing overall compared to others, or they don't feel as quick. But they are great for other playstyles, and they can be a bit easier to get the right socket colors on something like Belly of a Beast. So one of the setup is Spark, and if you have duration nodes in your tree, you can use Spark with Echo, faster projectiles, greater multiple projectiles, elemental proliferation, and chance to ignite. This is a great setup for standing a bit from the bosses, a bit from the mobs, not getting too close to them. But for the clear speed it's a bit slower as mentioned. Now if you don't have duration on your tree, I would take out the elemental proliferation and do it like this. Now you might wonder, why do you want elemental proliferation? Well, if you run Taming and Emberwake, proliferating the ignites will increase the damage increase you do. And it will also do more damage on the enemies. A little bit more, but you don't do too much fire damage with this setup. Now we've come to the last active setup, and it's with Blade Vortex. Now this is maybe not necessarily the slowest, but I've ranked it the lowest because I don't really like it anymore. There are maybe one big reason for this, and it's because when you use Blade Vortex as your active skill setup, you cannot have a cast when damage taken setup with it, because if your cast when damage taken setup with Blade Vortex activates, it will overwrite this setup. So maybe you had 15 stacks with this one, then your cast when damage taken setup will put one stack with the cast when damage taken setup Blade Vortex with just no damage, and you have to start from 0. So if you run this one, you have to drop the Blade Vortex in your cast when damage taken setup, and I don't think it's worth it. What setup I would run would be Echo, increased AoE, added fire, control destruction, and chance to ignite, if you would have increased duration nodes in your tree. If you don't have that, I would switch in the increased duration. Yeah, what I would drop out the first if you would go 5 link would be the increased AoE. So you could also run it like this as a 6 link. The Blade Vortex setup is best ran with dual Moku's Embrace for clearing, and on bosses you can switch to the Taming and Emberwake. It is also pretty mana hungry, just as the Incinerate setup is also pretty mana hungry. In my old build I used a skill node called Avatar of Fire, which I just want to cover quickly. Which I, in my AFK Gone Meta, have replaced with a Scepter with added fire damage to spells. And not attacks, to spells, it has to be that. Why I dropped it? Because I don't want the Chaos nodes, which are here. I don't want to take that pathing because I want my Duetus Elixir to trigger Savage Hit. So I thought, why take that route? It's really a waste of points. But it's not a bad route if you don't use Duetus Elixir, because the gearing would be a lot cheaper. So it's a good route to start with, and when you go really end game and have lots of currency, you can drop it and get a scepter like this and craft it. Now we've covered all the active setups, we've covered the rings, the jewelry we use with those. And really what I would like to do now is to showcase the different active setups in the same map. In this case it's gonna be a shipyard map. You might wonder why you're not running shaped strands, because most of the people I encounter don't run shaped strands. I did it this league and it was very efficient. I leveled up very well with the Slayer build I did, and I would really recommend doing so. It's a great way of doing the maps. Alright, so here we're gonna watch a clip where I clear a shipyard map with Abberath's Hooves, and I run it white because I wanted it to be the same for all the clearing clips. Now normally to increase the clearing speed you can run physical or elemental reflect with this version, because you have, if you've killed something recently, you have 5% leech on your fire damage, and that's enough to counter the reflect. Also your Duetus Elixir will make you leech 100% of your damage as life, so reflect is not a problem at all. Now when I run into the packs, you can by yourself, by just walking into them, activate most of your skills. But what I do is I have my Quicksilver active all the time. And then when I get into the packs, I press my Dreader's Elixir often. And the Dying Sun is pretty useful because it increases the AoE. But it also gives more projectiles to cast when damage skills like Fireball or Magma Orb, which can be useful. If you get a Fire Burst on the rares, which ignites them, they will most likely get 1 shot. When you don't ignite them, they will need 2 shots. And thanks to your powerful curses, they go down very quickly as long as you're close to them. Most packs are just destroyed by 1 Fire Burst. It's pretty neat. Here we're getting close to the boss, so I'll make a switch to Concentrated Effect. And walk some. And yeah, the bosses burn down pretty quickly as long as they're ignited. Yeah. Some are saying, oh, the single target when using Abberath's Hooves is terrible, and that is actually not the case. They get 1 shot most of the time as long as they get ignited. And here really the phase run is doing a lot of work because it isn't deactivated by the cast when damage setups I use. As long as you don't use any skill actively, the phase run will keep on running, and thanks to the Dreader's Elixir, we have a 5-second duration on it, and it's really nice. You can use Val Haste together with it to increase the movement speed even further. Okay, so we're gonna watch the Incinerate setup, and I'm gonna use it with dual Mucus Embrace, which I'm gonna use on the rest of the clearing setups. So we're starting again a white shipyard map to have the same mods of a map, which are none. And here we're Whirling Blade to have a fair comparison, because Abberath's Hooves I walk around, but with this setup you really want to Whirling Blade. Here we have something extremely dangerous, and I would just want to make you aware of this. This is an essence. I think it's a Essence of Corruption, yeah. And it has, you cannot leech. And not only that, it has Elemental Reflect. So the only thing keeping me alive here is me attacking other stuff around it. So yeah, that shouldn't be counted in the clearing speed because that's really, really rare. So the feel of Incinerate is really great. The packs just melt. It feels really well. The range is pretty far. And the mana leech is okay as long as you're in big packs. However, on some rares you'll run out of mana, which I think we'll encounter in this clip later on. Yeah, here I ran out of mana. So maybe you want to keep a mana flask or something for those scenarios. And I run it as a 6 link here. I don't really think you should do that. Run it as a 5 link, it will save you some mana, and also it will save you currency buying the chest plate, because it's not necessary to run this as a 6 link. So it feels really great. Here I came to the boss, so I probably switch to a concentrated effect, yeah. And then have my go. But yeah, as long as you get your ignite, even with this setup, it goes pretty quickly. So yeah. So it's a very nice, clear setup. I really like it. If it wouldn't be for the mana, it would be really nice. But on the other hand, you're not gonna run Abberath's Hooves with this version, and you're not gonna dual curse. You're gonna have some more mana to spare. Okay, so the clip we're watching now is the cast when channeling Scorching Ray with Firestorm, but instead of using Scorching Ray, in this clip I used Incinerate because it clears maps better, as Incinerate can hit and ignite and activate Fire Burst. Now it's a bit of cheating because this is normally something you want to run as a cheap setup, and I'm using Dying Sun, which increases the clear speed. But if you have the 3 duration nodes in the tree, you don't have to use the increased duration support gem, which I'm using in this setup. And then you can use LMP or GMP together with the Incinerate to have a clear speed like this one. So overall it feels really great. You get your ignites up, you have your firestorm after you've killed most of a pack, which then can hit the remaining mobs and kill them as well with a fireburst or things like that. So I would say that this setup almost feels as good as the Incinerate setup, because it's still Incinerate, you just have some slower projectiles. And you don't use as much mana and you have a greater single target. And for this setup I would normally use it with the Taming and Emberwake, but in this clip we're using Muku's Embrace to show the nice attack speed you gain of those. Because overall Muku's Embrace are better rings for map clearing, because the ignites are plenty to kill everything or most of things in a one shot. So you don't really need the Taming DPS. Here I'm at the boss, I switched to Concentrated Effect on Fire Burst. That wouldn't really be needed because we have a powerful single target with this setup, thanks to the cast when channeling. Here we teleported around a bit, I didn't get the Fire Burst Ignite. Here I'm desynced I think. But this setup is really great for boss killing, and I think it would work great on the Guardians really well actually. If you're not using the Valright fire setup I'm using. I think Phoenix you can take down with it and everything, because thanks to the Firestorm you have something hitting the boss all the time. Here we have a clearing clip of Sparks. It's a pretty nice setup. It can be ran in Bell of the Beast, which is an upside because it's a chestplate that gives us the most health. And I think it should be 5 or 6 linked. I think 6 linked is pretty good. It really is nice in this map because it has small rooms and it bounces very well. In more open maps I would say that the Incinerate setup is better. In this map they're almost as good. Usually this setup can be used with Elemental Proliferation, with Emberwake and Taming to increase the damage even further. But here we're using dual Muku's Embrace. As you can see it uses a lot less mana than the Incinerate, but it still uses a bit of mana. So it's also mana hungry, but not as mana hungry as the Incinerate setup I would say. Or maybe it's just better at getting back the mana, I don't know, because it hits targets all the time. But you can really keep it active throughout the boss fight. So I would say that it's a bit less mana hungry. But in maps like these it really shines, and it has a build technique or a clearing technique that doesn't require you to aim as much as the others, because it's hitting everywhere. If you have duration on your tree you don't need to use increased duration, which I think I used in this clip. Instead you can use things like Pierce or Elemental Proliferation or other things. Okay, so now we've come to the last clearing clip. And this is the clearing setup I like the least currently in the 2.6 patch, because of nerf Blade Vortex received, as I mentioned earlier. But still, it's not a bad clearing skill, it's just the worst if you ask me of the 5 I will mention today. So I just checked here if I changed my Blade Vortex to Blade Fall in the cast when damage setup, because you can absolutely not have a low level cast when damage Blade Vortex together with an active Blade Vortex. So Muku's Embrace really shines with the setup. It gives you the cast and attack speed you need. Of course the area of effect buff to Blade Vortex is nice. And the area gets pretty huge with Dying Sun. But if you think of a range that the Blade Vortex has, it's smaller than the Spark, and it's also smaller than the Incinerate. It's about as big as the cast when channeling Incinerate. But the cast when channeling Incinerate has a lot better single target. So we go for the bosses. Normally you would take Concentrate Effect on your Blade Vortex as well. But yeah, the bosses, they die pretty quickly as long as you add them and get the fire burst. So here it went pretty smoothly. I think it works real well, although it is the clearing setup I like the least. So just because I like it the least doesn't mean that it's bad, it's just the worst of the 5 if you ask me. Alright, to end this video I'd like to sum it up a little. When it comes to the clearing setups, it all comes down to preference. I like the Abberath Hooves version the most because it feels very nice when clearing, and also it combines very well with a Valor Righteous Fire setup. The downside is that the single target isn't the best of all the clearing setups we've talked about, if you don't count with Valor Righteous Fire. And also it costs a bit more than the other setups, it costs a couple of exalts more. So if you don't want to spend that much of a currency, I would recommend going with Incinerate or Cast when Channeling